It's not the carbs in the honey. It's not the fiber in the honey that makes it powerful. Okay, we need to take a bigger look than just looking at the macronutrient profile of food. I think we know enough now to know that the food matrix, our food quality, things like that matter significantly. And the evidence is pretty darn strong at this point that sugar in honey is not the same as regular sugar. Okay, I've done videos on that. What we need to understand, and this video is going to do a great job of explaining it, is the key thing that needs to be underscored is the effect on inflammation. How honey impacts inflammatory responses within our body based upon what is in specific kinds of honey. So we will talk about not just honey as a whole, but specific kinds of honey and which ones have more certain antioxidants, ones have certain flavonoids. But we'll also talk about visceral fat loss, we'll talk about general fat loss, insulin resistance, the whole gamut. So the big piece that we need to focus on is inflammation, right? So with this, we look at a study that was published in Phytotherapy Research. It was one of the more monumental studies on honey, quite frankly. It was 42 studies deep, so it was a meta-analysis. And they looked at what honey does in terms of inflammation. They found pretty significant results in terms of cytokine reduction. So honey, across almost all of these studies, reduced tumor necrosis factor, which is a cytokine, reduced interleukin-6, reduced interleukin-1 beta. That sounds like complex science that doesn't really matter, but the thing is that those cytokines are very, very critical when it comes down to just general inflammation within our body. But what we're starting to see now is that honey has an impact on what's called nuclear factor kappa B, which is sort of a master regulatory switch. So it's like at the master level, turns inflammation on or off. So we're seeing honey has an impact there. But what does all of this mean? How is it practical or pragmatic in any way? Well, we need to understand the different types of honey, so we'll get more granular there. With this, it comes down to a thing that is called a flavonoid. Now, a flavonoid is like a phenolic compound, or basically a plant compound that's in a food, right? We consume certain foods that are rich in antioxidants or phenolic compounds because of their flavonoid content. Now, there was a study that was published in Food Research International that did kind of a deep dive as to what flavonoids do. And when we extrapolate this and we put it in the context of honey, things start to make more sense. First of all, it's been demonstrated that flavonoids will free radical scavenge. Now, free radicals are going to be just like oxidative stressors. Whenever we metabolize food or anything like that, we have a variety of electrons that sort of escape the whole process of creating energy. These electrons escape and they bounce around and they impact our cells. They impact our cells so that they don't receive responses from insulin very well, all kinds of metabolic things, right? So when we reduce or we scavenge free radicals, it makes an impact on how our cells operate. So that's the first thing. Secondly, there is a direct inhibition of inflammatory enzymes, namely things like cyclooxygenase enzyme. Now, if you've ever taken ibuprofen before, ibuprofen blocks cyclooxygenase enzyme 2, COX-2. Okay, honey directly inhibits COX-2 from really increasing in the first place. So at an enzymatic level, it's stopping one of these like precursors to an inflammatory response. That's why people can literally even say, I feel like I have less joint pain when I have honey. It's, it's something we can't say with concrete evidence, but anecdotally, I've experienced it. There's also a direct reduction in the expression of cytokines, which is huge. And then now we're starting to see there's even genetic changes that occur when flavonoids are consumed to sort of prevent inflammatory responses in the future. So when we come back to honey, which honey has the highest flavonoid content? So with this, we look at a study that was published in the Journal of Food Properties, and it pretty clearly showed that like Manuka honey has the most flavonoids. But some of these other honeys were pretty good too. They tested for 14 different flavonoids, and Manuka ended up having 10 out of those 14 flavonoids. Typically speaking, when you're looking at antioxidant content of honey, antioxidants are going to make the honey a little darker. So you're going to see like darker honey is usually richer in antioxidants. That's not always the case, because flavonoids don't always equate directly to antioxidant quantity, right? So don't get too hung up on the darkness, but the bottom line is that Manuka seems to be pretty strong. We'll talk about some other ones in a second. But now we need to focus for a second on the blood sugar side of the equation, because this is where things get rather confusing. There are lots of different varieties of honey, and they all have different sort of glycemic index ratings, right? So we know that the GI scale is important when it comes down to insulin resistance. So typically we would say, hey, don't eat high glycemic foods, foods that spike your blood sugar really high. When you look at things like Manuka honey, it's about a 50 to 60 on the glycemic index scale. Then you look at something like wildflower honey is going to be like 65 to 75 on the glycemic index scale, significantly higher. But then you've got something like acacia honey, which is going to be like 30 to 40 on the GI scale. So at first glance, you'd say, well, people that are dealing with insulin resistance or inflammatory conditions there, maybe we want to go with acacia honey, but that's not the case. We need to look beyond this. So in the short term, yes, that could have an impact. The glycemic index could definitely have an impact. But longer term, we're missing the forest for the trees. The antioxidant quantity and the flavonoid quantity probably plays a bigger role long term, especially with insulin resistance, since inflammation can really make insulin resistance skyrocket much more. When you look at the varying GI scale of different honeys, all that's really looking at is the ratio of glucose to fructose. Like, it's not telling you whether a honey is good or bad per se. As a matter of fact, one could even make the argument that a lower glycemic honey is going to have a higher fructose content, and that fructose might be worse when it comes down to visceral fat or even liver fat accumulation. So you can see how it gets muddy there. But this is where a very important study comes in. Study published in Diabetologia, and it was looking at mice, but it was very powerful. They found that when they gave mice food and they gave them antioxidants, that it delayed the hyperglycemic response of a meal or sugar significantly. And it did this by increasing insulin sensitivity. So basically, by making the cell operate, let's just say, for lack of a better term, like cleaner and crisper, it was able to become more insulin sensitive and actually get glucose levels lower faster, even though they were having something high glycemic. So having antioxidants actually buffers this whole process, possibly even more than just the GI scale in general. What they also found in this study is that when obesity was in the equation, there was sort of a protection there as well. So the antioxidants in mice with obesity, it actually protected against these genetic changes. So it made it so that the mice were less likely to develop more insulin resistance as time went on. This is exactly why food quality, particularly honey quality, matters. It's not like you could just go and get a basic honey that is watered down or has added compounds or sugar to it. You want to get real good stuff. I put a link down below for a company called Manukora, which is the leading Manuka honey. It is a New Zealand Manuka honey. It's grown in remote forests in New Zealand, which is exactly where you're going to get the highest quality Manuka honey. So there's this thing called the MGO score. The MGO score sort of measures the antimicrobial content of Manuka honey. Okay. Every single batch that Manukora does, they third-party test for the MGO content, which is extremely important because that's what's looking at like the potency, the powerful nature of Manuka honey in the first place. This stuff is so potent that you really only need like a teaspoon per day. So even if you're doing like a low-carb diet, a teaspoon per day is nothing. This stuff is so powerful. So people guzzle honey because they want the benefits, when in reality, it's all about the quality rather than the quantity. We're not focused on the carbohydrate nature of it, we're focused on the beneficial properties of it. So I put a link down below. You can go to manukora.com/Thomas20. manukora.com/Thomas20, their starter kit, which is a tub of the 850 MGO honey, along with 5 stick packs, along with a wooden mixing spoon and a guidebook on how to use Manuka honey properly. I can tell you this is the easiest way to get the benefits of honey in, because you're talking just a teaspoon there. So this stuff is really good, not to mention it's delicious. So that link is down below. Again, manukora.com/Thomas20. Now let's talk fat loss. And if we go back to a study that was published in 2013, we could actually learn quite a bit. What this study did is, again, it was in rodents, but they gave rodents either a 10% solution of honey or a 90% solution. Okay, and they wanted to see what would happen over the course of, in this case, 91 days. Both groups that had the honey lost visceral fat, and both groups had protection against the regain of a fatty liver, like fat forming around the liver. But the group that had the 90% definitely had a stronger effect. What's interesting here is what's going on with honey and visceral fat, because if you look at old research, you think like carbohydrates, fructose, this is going to lead to visceral fat accumulation, but this study paints a pretty clear picture that there's something going on here, even when calories are equated for. So we're going to talk about the visceral fat part in just a second, but let's jump over to general fat loss so we have an idea there before we get into visceral fat. So with this, we look at a study that was published in the journal American College of Nutrition. And I love this study because they gave subjects 450 calorie meals that were isoglucidic. Okay, so they had the same exact amount of glucose, except one group had sucrose and one group had honey. Okay, same amount of calories, same amount of sugar, same GI, one was sucrose, one was honey. After this, they tested their glucose and other biomarkers every 30 minutes for a number of hours. What they found is that the group that had the honey over the sucrose had significant improvements in their postprandial glucose levels, so their glucose was much more stable and it came down faster. But even cooler, they had a massive increase in what's called PYY and a delayed increase in the hunger hormone ghrelin, which means they got hungry later. So they had honey, they weren't getting hungry super quick again, versus the sugar, they were getting hungry super quick again. The PYY also suppressed their appetite, so they ended up eating less as the day went on too. But now let's jump back to the visceral fat thing, because we needed some explanation just on the general fat loss piece though. Visceral fat and cortisol are highly correlated, okay, because visceral fat has more cortisol receptors in it. So when cortisol is elevated, we are more prone to store visceral fat. Well, it looks as though honey has an impact on cortisol levels. What happens is cortisol typically binds to a receptor in the visceral fat. That triggers what's called lipogenesis, but also downregulates what's called lipolysis. So it slows down fat loss in the visceral fat area, and it increases the potential for lipogenesis, or fat accumulation in the visceral fat area. So honey seems to throw a major wrench in this cycle. So in this case, we look at a study in biochemistry research. They put rats up to a stress test. Okay, so in this case, they had them do specific things that would induce stress, mainly physical activity-induced stress. Bottom line, honey crushed the cortisol levels. So in the honey intervention group, cortisol levels went down dramatically. And it's speculated that this is from one of maybe 4 reasons, or maybe all 4 reasons. One is simply going to be the antioxidant effect, so the reduction in oxidative stress. The reduction in oxidative stress is going to improve cortisol sort of rebound and clearance, so basically making it so it's going to have less of an impact. Secondly, it's speculated that the flavonoids have a direct impact on what's called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, which impacts cortisol, adrenaline, and all this. So it seems like the flavonoids might actually reduce or attenuate sort of that spike in cortisol that would happen there. Thirdly, there's the ability of these flavonoids to stabilize the glucose that would have risen from the stress. So when we're stressed out, glucose levels rise, and that can cause some problems. So it looks as though honey might actually attenuate that a little bit. And then finally, there's speculation and pretty good evidence that there's a gut-brain axis connection there too. So honey has a prebiotic effect that could be influencing how the gut communicates with the brain to modulate stress. Let's touch on this part for just a moment. There is a study that was published in the journal Frontiers in Nutrition. And if you look at the diagram that's on the screen right now, and you kind of zoom in on it, you can see that there's some interesting evidence that honey can really influence our gut microbiome, but also do some other things. So basically, when you digest honey, the sugars are digested, and then the other indigestible components, even some indigestible sugars, make it down into the colon. This changes rapidly the gut microbiome. So it changes it by increasing the good bacteria and decreasing the bad bacteria. So basically you have a microbial, what's called shift, which is pretty cool, because usually you can influence bacterial growth, but you don't usually get this shift that happens at one time. That's pretty cool. But additionally, if you look at this diagram, you find that honey increases anti-inflammatory cytokines within the gut. So basically it's reducing inflammation in the gut, which has a huge impact on our overall health. We don't realize how much of our inflammatory responses start in the gut. So I'm not saying that it all is gut related with honey. There's purely some other good stuff, but it seems like more is in the gut than we might think. And when you look at the antimicrobial effects of things like Manuka honey, it really starts to add up. which also makes sense because we've seen that like Manuka honey or other forms of honey even, but specifically Manuka, actually have the ability to suppress pathogens. And we're seeing this in the same Frontiers in Nutrition study, the suppression of pathogens, as we can see in this diagram, in the gut itself. So thereby reducing the inflammatory cascade that might happen as a result of that. So we come full circle back to inflammation being one of the most important, if not the most important aspect of why we should be consuming honey here and there. I don't think it's something we need to be consuming gallons of, but a tablespoon or a teaspoon every day. You're talking a minimal amount of carbohydrates for a monumental impact. I'll see you tomorrow.